All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got chapter 30 or chapter 29, depending on what edition of the book you have. The Collapse of the Old Order, 1929 to 1949. We'll be looking at section 1, the Stalin Revolution. This chapter in particular really centers around World War II. Its causes and the things that preceded it, and then the war itself. It begins with a chapter on Stalin, Joseph Stalin here. And if you recall, we talked about Stalin in a previous chapter. We're looking at the events in Russia, specifically the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the Russian Revolution was the transformation from the Russian Empire, which was formerly led by the Tsar, into the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union, which was the first communist nation in the world, right? First communist nation in the world. The Russian Revolution was led by Lenin. However, when Lenin died, there was essentially two people fighting for power. Joseph Stalin, who was more of a bureaucrat, kind of like a secretary for the Communist Party. But by being the secretary, he had dealt a lot with people, and he knew a lot of people in the Communist Party. There were people loyal to him. He knew everything about everyone in the Communist Party. Leon Trotsky, who was in charge of the army, the Red Army, which was eventually successful in the Russian Civil War. Eventually, it was Stalin who won out. And by the 1930s, he was a dictator of the Soviet Union. So we'll call Joseph Stalin dictator of the Soviet Union. And the level of control, sometimes referred to as totalitarian, meaning that Stalin had total control of not just the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, really the International Communist Party in some ways too, and full control in the Soviet Union in Russia. His nickname was the Man of Steel. This helped contribute to a certain cult of personality to which Stalin was, in some cases, worshipped like a deity. But Stalin, his major goal was to transform Russia, right, and transform it very rapidly. 5-year plans. A 5-year plan was a plan to turn Russia into an industrial nation. When it came to the Industrial Revolution, Russia, for the most part, lagged behind. It was one of the reasons as to why the Russians were not as successful in World War I. And so Stalin's plan, 5-year plans, it would take 5 years, was this process of industrialization. What do we mean by industrialization? Well, we mean the production of these products: electricity, steel, iron, and coal. Industrialization done by force. And recall that, for the Soviet Union, it was not an industrialization that was done in the same way as, let's say, a capitalist system in which producers create things for consumers to buy. This was driven primarily by the state. It was quota driven. And the idea was that once the Soviet Union reached certain levels of coal production, iron production, steel production, that it would be on par with other nations. This was especially true when it came to the mid-1930s, let's say 1933, when Adolf Hitler became the chancellor in Germany, that the quota system was primarily aimed towards heavy industry. And that was to prepare for eventually war, right? Because there was a very hostile state surrounding the Soviets, not just in Nazi Germany, but also fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. In order to do this, it required taking Russia's large peasant population and forcing them to become workers. Again, see what it does, right? This idea of industrialization done by force. It was, a very bloody process, but at the same time, very effective. Russia fundamentally transformed itself from primarily an agrarian nation, a very kind of rural and spread out nation, into a nation that was amongst the most industrial in the world by the time that World War II broke out. In order to do this, it required the collectivization of agriculture. Essentially, what that means is to take individual plots of land, right, And typically farmers would own a little plot of land, and each farmer would be responsible for growing whatever they could grow on that land. And instead, to take those farms and create a large-scale farm, take each of these farmers and again, turn them into workers, send them to a city to work in a factory. And then once all the farms are combined together, then things like heavy machinery can be used in order to make agriculture more effective. So the idea was to transform agriculture from individual production into mass production, and to use heavy machinery in order to do that. However, the collectivization of agriculture is probably described by most as a disaster on two areas. One was some of the famines that were created. It just simply disrupted too much of the seasonal output to take farmers who knew how to grow the crops and who understood the soil and growing seasons, and to place farming under a government bureaucrat didn't produce the same type of yield. Famine in the 1930s, 1933 through 1934 especially, led to the starvation of, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And it also led to the persecution of Kulaks. Kulaks were rich and successful farmers. The collectivization of agriculture required that farmers turn over their crops, turn over their livestock, not for a profit, but to dedicate it to, or to give it to the state. The kulaks, who were the ones who were the most successful, refused to give their livestock and to give their crops to the Stalinist regime. They would rather slaughter their own livestock. They burned down their fields, and for this they were heavily persecuted. The liquidation of the kulaks describes the persecution and imprisonment of those who did not turn over crops, right? Crops and livestock. Between the kulaks who were killed and between the famine, millions of people died as a result of agriculture. At the same time, this was also a regime that centered around Joseph Stalin. You can see this image here, propaganda with Stalin, and you can see the red flag with agriculture in this area. Joseph Stalin, like Adolf Hitler in Germany, maintained and established totalitarian rule, and this was done through a number of different methods. The NKVD, this is the Stalinist secret police. And the secret police was established in order to keep Stalin in power. In fact, 1/3 of the Communist Party was purged. That means, gotten rid of, made disappeared, exiled, etc., etc. Even Stalin's old rival, Leon Trotsky, who challenged Stalin for power, was assassinated by Joseph Stalin and the NKVD in order to further consolidate his control. So any potential threat to Stalin's power was eliminated by the NKVD or the secret police. At the same time, people used this terror to their advantage, right? People took opportunities in this terror. And the terror was the belief, part of the reason that contributed to the terror was the belief that there were counter-revolutionaries, and counter-revolutionaries would be people willing to overthrow, or at least undermine, this communist experiment. Recall that the Soviet Union is the first communist country ever established in the world. It's surrounded by incredibly hostile powers, including Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And so the fear was that there were people inside the Soviet Union that were actively undermining it. And so what people did was they used this to their advantage to get rid of their enemies, and that was to accuse people of being counter-revolutionaries. If you were accused of being a counter-revolutionary, even though there might not have been any strong evidence for it, you could be forced into the Gulags. The Gulags were the prison and labor camps. And millions of people in the Soviet Union were sent to these forced labor camps where the conditions were horrible. Millions of people died in the gulags. This sort of sentiment of terror was further supported by purge trials or show trials. These were kind of fake trials in which communist leaders confessed to treason. In fact, a number of Soviet generals were convinced that the patriotic and right thing to do was to admit to crimes they had not committed, to admit that they were treasonous, and to admit that the threat of counter-revolution was very much real. And they were executed for it. So it kind of led to this, or it kind of contributed to this spectacle that the Soviet Union was constantly under threat, and there were people inside actively undermining it. And in order to get rid of them, you needed a giant police state to go out and arrest people and send them to Gulag and send them into prison camps. At the same time, women were also part of this great experiment. Women workers got opportunities in male fields, right? Especially when it came to labor. Men and women were part of this collective to further the Soviet experiment. At the same time, while Stalin's industrialization plan was highly successful, we might sort of best wrap this up, or best describe the Stalinist revolution as effective and violent, right? Effective and violent.